When President Nixon and his party traveled to Peking in 1972, Art Buchwald wrote that he had come into possession of captured Chinese communist documents, indicating that Chinese intelligence had unearthed a super-secret United States agency called the State Department. That indeed the head of that department, called by insiders the Secretary of State, was actually traveling with the president, a white-haired gentleman who mingled discreetly with the crowd of reporters, cultivating inconspicuousness, while the business of state was handled ostensibly and ostentatiously by presidential aide Henry Kissinger. Art Buchwald having blown the operation, President Nixon in due course surfaced by the Department of State by naming Henry Kissinger as its head. He is, I guess it is safe to say, the most conspicuous Secretary of State in American history. And although, as every schoolboy knows, the authority to write foreign policy is the prerogative of the president, the reliance of the incumbent president on the advice of Mr. Kissinger is widely advertised by the president himself. The paradox is that Mr. Kissinger's huge personal successes are not reflected on the historical record. It is as if everyone at the Olympic Stadium joined in carrying an athlete on their shoulders in an endless triumphal procession, without pausing to realize that in fact he had won no gold medals at all. Perhaps he struck the fancy of the crowd because they knew that he was fated to lose, but admired the brilliance of his performance. Perhaps in a great seizure of auto-hypnosis, the crowd thought he was winning, even as inconspicuous, muscle-bound little athletes were busily scoring in one event after another. Moreover, the allure of the champion is strengthened, not weakened, by his own refusal to declare himself the winner. Sometimes he seems to be saying that there are no such things as diplomatic victories. Sometimes he seems to be saying even darker things, such as that the end of Western civilization is in sight and our descent should be dignified and perhaps even good-natured. I should like to begin by asking Secretary Kissinger why he thought to give President Nixon to read a one-volume edition of Spengler's Decline of the West.
Oh, because I had discussed my early interest in philosophy of history with President Nixon, and I pointed out to him that I thought that Spengler, with many of whose conclusions I didn't agree, nevertheless in his perception of the rise and fall of civilizations as integrated units, that is to say, in which politics, art, architecture, science were all part of the same perception, that was an interesting way of looking at the problem of civilization, not necessarily a prediction of our civilization.
Well, did you expect that he would learn to see more acutely what was happening to our civilization simply by mastering Spengler's technique or by sharing in Spengler's Weltschmerz?
Well, first of all, I think it is incorrect to say that Spengler suffered from Weltschmerz. I think that what Spengler attempted to do is to show that civilizations follow a certain rhythm and a certain sequence of events, and it is therefore wrong to say it's optimistic or pessimistic. It is more important to understand whether his perception had some validity. The reason, however, that I discussed this with President Nixon was to emphasize that the manifestation of events which come up in the form of tactical decisions are very often quite misleading, and that a statesman has to understand what the trend of events is, whether it is in a positive or in a negative direction, and has to understand that there are many seemingly unrelated manifestations of a total culture that affect the scope of policy and the direction that it can take.
Well, but it's also...
I was much less interested in the predictions of Spengler than in his perception.
Than in his technique.
Besides, he had read Toynbee, so I had to give him another road.
Well, there's a certain irreversibility, isn't there, in Spengler's view of things, which I take it you did not want to suggest to the president.
I don't believe that there's an irreversibility in events, but I do believe that to reverse a trend requires more than proclamations. And it is important to understand what the trend is before one can reverse it.
Well, I think most people would agree, although sometimes trends are accidentally reversed, even by people who fail to understand them, isn't that, just as they are unintentionally accelerated.
Yes, but if you make policy, you cannot do it in the expectation of a miracle or of an accidental reversal. The problem of policy making is to get some conscious control over events. Now, if an accident helps you, you're lucky, but you cannot conduct affairs on the basis of the expectation of winning at roulette.
No, but doesn't the making of policy sometimes call simply for the buying of safe time? I remember when Mr. Churchill, speaking in 1949 at MIT, perhaps you were there, said that perhaps the death, he didn't name him, but his allusion was clearly to Stalin, would give to the West the same advantages that the death of Genghis Khan gave us. And there's a sense in which policy can be understood as hoping things will change for the better, meanwhile simply playing it as safe as you can. Is that correct?
Sometimes you have to play for time in the expectation of some change, such as the one to which Churchill referred. But to the extent possible, there has to be some rational explanation of what you're waiting for. You cannot simply conduct policy waiting for a favorable accident. But it was a perfectly rational expectation that the death of Stalin would bring about important domestic changes in the Soviet Union, and therefore playing for that time was a reasonable course of action.
Is it rational to expect that the collision of Marxist ideology with historical reality will affect in such a way as to be advantageous to the West Soviet policy in the future?
First of all, no system of government and no ideology has ever remained unaffected by time. And it would be an extraordinary event if Marxist ideology were to remain unchanged as the only ideology in history. So I believe inevitably the evolution of history will bring about a change in Marxist ideology. Now, whether that change of Marxist ideology will be for the benefit of the West, whether it will lead to a possibility of a more conciliatory foreign policy, or whether instead it will lead to a gradual spread of Marxist perceptions around the world. This depends not only on time, but it depends on the nature of the opposition. It depends on the vitality of competing values and on the ability to prevent major foreign policy successes by countries that profess the Marxist ideology.
But isn't there a sense in which the vitality of the opposition to the growth of Marxist doctrines plays into the theoretical hands of the tablet keepers of Marxism? Because this is, of course, what they predicted, that we would resist and resist even at bayonet point, in as much as we were dominated by our fascination for and greed for property and domination of the ruling class, of the working class.
So you think that the fact of resistance fuels Marxist ideology?
I think it can, yes.
I think, but surely the opposite couldn't be true, that the absence of resistance would weaken communist ideology. I can't accept this proposition. It depends on the nature of the resistance. and it depends on the adaptation that Marxism itself has to make to contemporary realities.
Well, are we prepared for either contingency? There is the possibility, as you say, that the evolution of the communist idea will go in the direction beneficent, in a beneficent direction, in a direction conducive to the interests of the West, and there is the alternative possibility. We seem to be preparing almost exclusively for the latter rather than for the former.
That they're going in a
beneficent direction?
Not at all. It is my view that whether it will go in a direction beneficial to the West or whether it will confirm existing stereotypes depends very importantly on the performance of the West or on the performance of the non-communist world and on the adaptations that Marxist ideology has to make to reality and to a reality that we ourselves have to be instrumental in creating. And I do not agree with you at all that our policy is based on the proposition that without effort on our part, history will do our work for us, and that Marxist ideology will change without effort on our side, and without our resistance to foreign policy pressure.
Well, I believe you to begin with, and it seems to me that your record makes this plain, but it also seems to me that here you are not in harmony with the American establishment. The American establishment seems to subsidize anti-communist efforts up to a certain point, at which point attrition takes over and they pull out. It seems to me plain that the disaster of Indochina, against which you struggled, was a disaster nevertheless. And it certainly confirmed those Marxists who believe that the imperialist world, as they call us, is soft and lacking in purpose. Now, to what extent is this a realistic historical judgment, or to what extent is it simply a capricious application of ideological theories?
Well, I have always considered Indochina a disaster, perhaps partly because we did not think through the implications of what we were doing at the beginning.
Does we mean you included?
Well,
or
I
pre
was
you?
Pre my being in office. Those decisions were made in the previous administration. And partly because the magnitude of the task we had set ourselves was not clear when it was said, and then the American public was not prepared to stick with it. So it failed for a variety of reasons, but none of them was that any of the policymakers, as it drew to a conclusion, thought that history would do our job for us, or that failure in Indochina would help us in the general relationship with the communist world.
Well, do you consider that the American public is coextensive with the American Congress when you use that term? Is it the public that let us down, or is it Congress that let us down?
But I think the Indochina problem is a very complex one, because in a way you can say we let ourselves down also by entering too lightly on an enterprise whose magnitude wasn't understood, by methods which were inappropriate to the scale of the problem, and then were caught by what I would think was a minority, but nevertheless a very determined minority, in a situation in which the effective public support disintegrated. I don't know whether I would make a distinction here between the Congress and the public. I think probably the Congress came to reflect public sentiment, so that finally in the ultimate collapse last spring, there was clearly no public support for any continuation of the American effort. All public opinion polls seem to show this.
Now, is it possible that your own policies and those of President Nixon and President Ford contributed to the confusion with which, to the confusion that rendered the voice of the American public or the American Congress so indecisive? I give you one example. A question was asked of President Ford in March of this year, the answer to which I will spare you the embarrassment of reading. But the question was, Mr. President, the question is raised by many critics of our policy in Southeast Asia as to why we can conduct a policy of détente with the two communist superpowers in the world and could not follow a policy of détente with Cambodia and South Vietnam. Could you explain that to us? The answer is he could not. I'm sure you can, but it takes some high-flying and dialectical reconciliations, doesn't it?
Not at all, in my view. Although I would not make Indochina policy the test case of our foreign policy in general. Our policy has been firmly opposed to a expansion of the communist sphere or to an expansion to foreign policy adventures by communist countries. Therefore, to the extent that North Vietnam was engaging in systematic aggression against all of its neighbors, it was absolutely consistent with our policy that we would resist that. To us, the policy of relaxation of tensions with the two major communist countries does not presuppose any degree of ideological approbation. It is a practical accommodation to new realities, and it does not go so far as to acquiesce in any foreign policy adventures. And therefore, at the time of the Jordan crisis of 1970, the building of a submarine base in Cuba, the Middle East crisis in 1973, the administration always reacted with extreme firmness to what we perceive to be foreign policy challenges by any of the communist countries. And I think the American public will have to understand that, on the one side, in the age of nuclear superpowers and the capability of destroying tens of millions of people in a very brief time in a war, that the problem of peace is of great consequence. But at the same time, not to disarm ourselves where we will not resist foreign pressures. Now, this requires a more sophisticated, a more complicated perception of the international environment than was possible in the 40s and 50s. But I see no inconsistency between resisting foreign expansion and attempting to moderate the conduct of the communist countries at the same time.
Well, but Mr. Secretary, the aggression by the North Vietnamese depended for its success on Soviet and Red Chinese arms. It is an aggression that they would have had to have used slingshots to fuel if it had not been for the fact that they were clearly client states of the two great superpowers with whom we were carrying on this policy of détente. So isn't it some sort of a semantical illusion to suppose that you can prescind the North Vietnamese act of aggression as though it were not in fact sponsored by the Soviet Union?
No, I don't think it was sponsored by the Soviet Union. I think it was supported by the Soviet Union. I think there was a clear, generic, and indigenous impetus to the North Vietnamese military actions in Indochina. Secondly, the policy of relaxation of tension began systematically only after the Indochina War was already started, and I think it was used in part to some effect to bring it to a conclusion on terms which, if we had sustained our effort, would have been a tolerable, that is, if we had sustained our resistance, would have been a tolerable outcome. But I do not believe that the case of Indochina, which goes back to the early 60s, is a good test case of the general policy.
Well, would you say that the activities of the Soviet Union and Portugal would be a better example?
I would say that we have to recognize that the Soviet Union and the United States are ideological opponents, that the Soviet Union, that the relaxation of tensions has never been conceived by any of us as ending competition and the possibility of conflict. They are a means by which a competition which is inevitable in the nature of present circumstances is regulated while reducing the danger of nuclear war. With respect to Portugal, the basic cause of the disintegration of the political situation in Portugal is due to factors indigenous to Portugal. It is true that the Soviet Union has given some assistance to the Communist Party in Portugal. It is also true that until recently, this could be an important factor only because the West did not resist with the determination that it should have. So it is not our view that the Soviet Union will not take advantage of opportunities that may be presented. It is, however, our view that they can be maintained if we act with wisdom and determination within manageable bounds.
But since we operate in a free society, you really do need a thing called public support, the lack of which made it impossible for you to stick it out in Indochina. But isn't that public support gravely threatened by shifting moral perceptions that flow out of the ideological egalitarianism that goes into détente? Let me give you one example. The Gallup poll reported 1 month after your return in 1972 from Peking as follows. In the period leading up to this historic event, we have seen a far more favorable image that the U.S. public has of the Chinese communists today than they did in the mid-60s. Respondents to the poll were asked to select from a list of 23 favorable and unfavorable adjectives, those which they feel best describe the Chinese communists. The terms ignorant, warlike, sly, and treacherous were named most often in 1966. But now the measurement taken shows them to be, quote, hardworking, intelligent, artistic, progressive, and practical. Now, the transformation in the People's Republic of China between 1966 and 1972 was in fact a radical transformation. There is a sense in which conservative elements were defeated during the Cultural Revolution, the old communist cadres. In any event,
But not your kind of conservative.
No, not mine. No, and I'm glad to say not yours, to return the compliment. But it is plain that the American people, as witness those who have traveled to China, people like Ken Galbraith, Scotty Reston, Barbara Tuchman, come back, and sure enough, we hear those old voices from the 30s, the trains are running on time. Now, how can a free society husband the moral flywheel necessary to distinguish between desirable and undesirable societies in the wake of such relativism as is stimulated by the philosophy of Descartes?
First, let me say that if one pushed your argument to a conclusion, one would have to say that the United States must maintain international tensions in order to make sure that its people have the correct perception of the nature of the societies with which they're dealing. It is one of the tasks before us to enable the United States to conduct a vital foreign policy without moral relativism and also without the black and white categories with which we tended to sustain ourselves in the past. In the past, we used to think that relations between countries were either peace or war, that wars were caused by evil people, and that if we approached relations of peace with a country or eased relations with a country, that also indicated an improvement in the moral climate of this country. In the world in which we find ourselves now, in the world of nuclear superpowers, in the world in which American power is no longer as predominant as it was in the late 1940s, it is necessary for us to conduct a more complicated foreign policy without these simple categories of a more fortunate historical past. So I think we have to come to an understanding that the communist societies are morally, in their internal structure, not acceptable to us, that their ideology is one that is not compatible necessarily with our own, but that nevertheless, on the plane of day-to-day foreign policy, we may be prepared to make those practical accommodations that preserve the peace as long as vital interests aren't threatened. The moral quality of life in China did not dramatically change between 1969 and 1972. And in no public statement have I ever claimed that the fact that we are working out specific arrangements, either with the People's Republic of China or with the Soviet Union, indicates that there has been an evolution in their domestic structure towards a more pluralistic system. We have to avoid creating the illusion that progress on some foreign policy questions, such as nuclear arms agreements, means that there has been a change in the domestic structure. So this Gallup poll in part reflects a kind of perception of the nature of the international environment that inevitably will have to be changed. And I believe that it is the task of our national leaders to be able to maintain both the moral strength of the country and to do the practical steps that need to be taken for whatever national purposes we set ourselves.
But they're not very good at it. Now, you and Mr. Nixon didn't invent coexistence. The idea of coexistence, as a matter of fact, was affirmed by Eisenhower. And he did, in fact, meet Khrushchev here one tense day in 1969. But he sought to make it plain by those fine gestures that diplomats study, that there was a continuing, indeed a rather heated disapproval of the means by which Khrushchev maintained himself in power and his people subject. I'm trying to say that in an enthusiasm for détente, the American people are listening to rapturous descriptions of life in China, in the course of which—
But not from us.
Not from you, but from people with whom you've associated very closely. As a matter of fact, this may amuse you, CREEP, the Mr. Nixon's organization, one of its items that it had was a stock letter
I was going to say I don't go skiing with Mr. Galbraith, largely because I don't ski.
That's the only reason you can think of, huh? Well, that was a diversionary maneuver, Mr. Secretary. As a matter of fact, Mr. Galbraith and I are very good friends, but when we tried to make a date for a firing line just a couple of months ago, and he told me that he couldn't make it on the 1st of April because he was lecturing at the University of Moscow, I asked him what left did he have to teach them. But but in any case, a creep, an official organization devoted to the re-election of Mr. Nixon, was sending out a form letter to every newspaper in the United States that carried anything I wrote disparaging to China. And it didn't say the kind of things you said. It didn't say, Mr. Buckley is a child, and he doesn't recognize that we can't ignore 700 million people, and so on and so forth. He said Mr. Buckley fails to understand the great achievements that Mao Zedong has performed for the Chinese people, the kind of thing that they used to say about Hitler before he became truly insufferable. Now, what I'm saying is that all of a sudden you find yourself face to face with terrible problems that issue from that confusion. They started to give you hell when they found out that you tried to, quote, destabilize the coming to power of Allende in Chile. I don't think that they would have given you hell for trying to do that in an age, which was not so long ago, when it was understood that we had to coexist with the enemy, but that we certainly were going to do everything that we could to help people to stay free.
Well, I believe that the nature of our domestic debate on foreign policy has been severely affected by the upheavals of the 60s, by the assassinations, by Vietnam, by Watergate, and I believe that there are much more fundamental factors, that these are much more fundamental factors in the randomness of our debate, where one can be at one and the same time be accused of being both too tough and too soft on communist countries, than the policy of relaxation of tensions. Because what is the policy of relaxation of tensions? It attempts to recognize that in the nuclear age, statesmen have a responsibility not to risk nuclear war lightly. Secondly, they attempt to take into account the realities of major communist countries and the realities of the American power position in the present world. They attempt to do this while maintaining the overall military balance and the overall geopolitical balance. This is a complicated, this is without question a much more complicated task than the one that existed in the 50s. We are trying to avoid, if you look at the foreign policy of the 50s and 60s, to which you refer with some nostalgia, you will see wild oscillations between extremes of intransigence and extremes of conciliation. And as early as the summit meetings of 1954, you could find rapturous quotes of how the fact that the leaders met in an atmosphere of better human relations, how that changed the whole nature of the environment. What we have attempted to do is to conduct foreign policy on a more sober basis and to avoid these wild swings between extremes of conciliation and extremes of intransigence, to find a policy that is geared to our national interest and to our basic values and that can be sustained over a period of time. Now, I deplore this particular statement that Creep sent out, but they were not selected for
it wasn't considered a dirty trick, you see. It was considered
I don't consider it a dirty trick, but they were not selected for their positions by because of their competence in foreign policy.
No, no. I gave it merely as an example because they were attempting to say something that the people would find internally plausible. You see,
yes,
a lot of people
you cannot in an election year under the pressure of in an electoral period, many ill-considered things are being done. But I do not think you will find any official statement from the Department of State since I've become Secretary of State, or from the White House for that matter, which would make these claims.
No, you see, I'm not saying that you personally endorse this view of life in China. I'm saying that certain deductions are drawn from the intimacy of the highest diplomatic contacts with China, which results in Gallup finding that the majority of the American people think of the poor Chinese as intelligent, artistic, progressive, and practical.
Yes, but I think the solution to this problem is not to generate artificial crisis, but to try to overcome this simple Manichaeanism in which one side has to assert absolute good and the other absolute evil before you can develop a practical policy, because it is precisely this attitude that leads to these wild swings that over a period of time also demoralize our public.
You're talking to somebody who can get excommunicated if he believes in Manichaeanism, so I'd be very careful not to engage that heresy. But I do sharply understand what you are saying, what you are trying to achieve, but I'm here to predict great troubles for you, as witness this. In the last few months, if you had elected to go to the help of Portugal, I'm not sure the American people would have, in fact, permitted you to do so. I think there would have been a standard, a lachrymose editorial in the New York Times and in the Washington Post, weeping over lost Portuguese liberties, but saying, after all, they're used to being without liberty under Salazar. But they would be much more interested in whether the CIA had dropped an unfriendly balloon over South Portugal and would haul you up and ask you if you were up to your old Chilean tricks again. Now, my point is that schematically, your policy is easier to understand in a society in which you have total power to dominate foreign policy. But the difficulties that you like to get into are precisely those that trace to America's attempt to fuse some sense of moral purpose into their foreign policy.
Yes, but first of all, I believe that there's no inconsistency between infusing a moral purpose in our foreign policy and the policies we are pursuing. I believe that moral purpose must be related to a series of practical steps that can be taken. Practical steps without moral purpose become random, and without moral purpose, no leader will have the assurance and the confidence to act in situations in which the choices are always unclear at a moment when the scope for action is still relatively wide. So I don't accept the antithesis between moral purpose and pragmatism. I think without strong moral purpose, there cannot be an effective foreign policy. At the same time, when one translates moral purpose into policy, one has to look at the realities of the situation, or one runs the risk of empty posturing. Now, in this translation, there is the danger of moral confusion that you've described. And this is particularly great if the opponents of the prevailing policy, whatever the prevailing policy is, state their case in very absolute terms, because
they're surrealistic.
That's right, because they will not be responsible for the consequences of their assertions, and they don't necessarily look at the alternatives that were in fact available. And it is in those terms that I believe we have a problem of educating the public. We are living in a more complicated period than the one in which we formed our historical perceptions. And we have this problem of education at a time when respect for authority of whatever kind, but especially executive authority, is declining for reasons independent of the specifics that we've been discussing, but due to the upheavals of the 60s and 70s, and where the
an atomized ethos.
You have that, and you have executive, legislative difficulties. So we are in a very difficult period for the conduct of foreign policy. There's no question about this. But if the American people develop the idea that its government is artificially creating crisis or unnecessarily creating crisis, we would repeat the divisions of the Vietnam War, which, even though I believe they were caused by a minority, contributed substantially to the demoralization of what you consider the American establishment.
Well, if I understand you correctly, if an Allende were to come to power tomorrow, you would not feel that you could recommend such action as you thought appropriate in 1970. So that even in the last 4 years...
No, I'm not saying that. And I would also go back to what you said about Portugal. I think that the realities of our situation, and not the realities of the relaxation of tensions policy, because that was a very minor factor, but the realities of the domestic evolution that has occurred in this country required a rather deliberate approach to the problems of Portugal. Also, particularly because Portugal is more a West European problem than a United States problem, and we thought it was important to bring the West Europeans with us. Our perception of the evolution in Portugal was always clear, was repeatedly stated, and was in fact frequently criticized for being too pessimistic. Once we had achieved an agreement with the West European countries about the nature of the danger, I don't think it would be correct to say that we were totally passive about the evolution there. With respect to what one would do in similar circumstances, in the case of Chile, a case which has been wildly oversimplified in much of the discussion, I think our perception of the problem would not be radically different from what it was in 1970.
Oh, your perception would not be, I'm sure, but does that mean that you would feel that you could share that perception with the relevant committees of Congress and win them around, or do you think that there has been a sea change there?
Yes, but the sea change that has occurred in America is not, in my view, caused by the policy that is being conducted vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and Communist China. The sea change that has been caused in America is a almost metaphysical revulsion against foreign involvements that involve risks. And in fact, the anomaly of the situation in which we find ourselves is that on the one hand, there is theoretical anti-communism. On the other hand, there is an enormous practical reluctance to run any of the risks that would be associated with a rhetoric that many engage in. And it is one thing to have a crisis that lasts a day or two, such as the Cambodia incident, but the Maya gas incident. But the real test is to sustain a crisis over an extended period of time. And there I would think that anything that looks to the public like a massive foreign involvement would require the most meticulous justification before it could be supported. This is our difficulty in the Congress and in surfaces, for example, with respect to the technicians that we are proposing at the urgent and insistent request of the parties to send to the Sinai, in which there's a considerable debate starting over 200 Americans in an area where there are already
and volunteers,
civilians, unarmed, in an area where Sweden has over 1,000 troops, Finland has nearly 1,000, Austria has about 800, Canada has hundreds, troops, without any debate in their countries that it might involve them in a war. This is the psychological environment in which we have to conduct our foreign policy, and which has to be understood when one engages in rhetoric of confrontation.
What caused that?
I think what has caused it is in part the experience of Vietnam, in part the experience of Watergate, in part the disillusionment of the 60s and 70s, but it is a fact that anyone in a responsible position must take into account.
So therefore, you would not really differentiate my pessimism from your own. You simply insist that those difficulties that you have issue from a recalcitrant public.
No, I have. I'm not that pessimistic. I believe that, first of all, in my travels in the country, I have the sense that the public wants to believe in its government and wants to believe that it has a sense of direction. We are going through a temporary, through a period of temporary difficulty. And I believe we have to adjust our perceptions to a new reality that has emerged after a generation after the end of World War II. And that we have to explain that at one and the same time we may oppose countries and yet cooperate with them for specific limited purposes. That we have an obligation to prevent nuclear war, and that this nevertheless does not mean that a final moral reconciliation has taken place. I believe that this can be done depending on the willingness of the various leadership groups in this country to accept complexity. If we insist on simplification, then we will have endless domestic civil wars between simplifiers on both sides of the debate.
Do you find more resistance to complexity among hard hats or among Harvard professors? I won't tell Galbraith what you said.
No, it's about equal.
About equal. So it is, therefore, it is a problem that runs right through all classes of Americans.
Well, I would think that, at least from where I sit, the public, the general public, despite all the shocks, is less cynical in this country, basically healthier, basically more vital than in any other Western country. And therefore, fundamentally, we are the hope of the non-communist world. If we don't lead, there will be no leadership. And if we don't act with confidence, no one else will. So I'm not basically pessimistic about the future of this country. We tend to tear ourselves apart in our leadership groups with some of the debates that you and I have been discussing here. But structurally, I think this country is still a very vital and very hopeful phenomenon.
Is it, do you find it difficult when people come to you, congressmen, senators, governors, and so on, to bring them around on points that you consider to be vital? I think, for instance, of the difficulties you had on the Turkish issue, which struck me as one of the few questions concerning which there is clearly a right answer and a wrong answer. Now, did you actually attempt to persuade congressmen to permit the sale of arms to Turkey?
Well, I think one of the problems with respect to Turkish aid is that when I believe there is clearly a right answer, but I also believe that public opinion at large is not greatly exercised on this issue because it is too abstruse and esoteric for them. Therefore, relatively small minorities that are highly organized, very vocal, and very passionate can have a major impact. Secondly, the original vote on Turkish aid occurred at the absolute low point of executive authority in the immediate aftermath of
the resignation
of President Nixon, and at a time when the congressional leadership, which was with us, had lost control of its followers. So that I'm certain that if that vote came up today, that the Congress would never override a presidential veto. At that time, it overrode 3 presidential vetoes, really out of a desire to assert itself. Then I think perhaps we made some mistakes initially in presenting the issue, and that pushed the whole debate in a wrong direction. I don't think an event like the Turkish aid vote could be repeated today, but it is symptomatic for what can happen in a slightly disintegrated situation.
Well, if it's as important as you say it is, and as important as it is in my opinion, why is there not a greater sense of alarm in Europe and in America over that development?
Well, I think in Europe there's very profound alarm. The Secretary General of NATO, for example, has invited himself to Washington. Indeed, he's meeting with the President today. I repeat, he invited himself, we didn't invite him, to register. He's a good friend of ours, I must say. I emphasize the fact that he invited himself only to indicate the alarm that he's feeling about the erosion of the relationship of Turkey to NATO, which coincides with the alarm we feel about the erosion of our relationship with Turkey under conditions that are of no help to Greece and Cyprus. So it is one of those decisions that help nobody.
Is the United Nations less and less appropriately the chamber in which questions of this kind can be discussed?
No, the United Nations in its present form has not proved suitable for dealing with the fundamental issues of peace and war. It provides a forum for the exchange of ideas. It sometimes provides a vehicle in which parties can meet conveniently. It does a useful job on certain technical problems. I have expressed our concern about the bloc voting that is developing there. And I must say this expression of concern may have contributed to the relative moderation that has occurred at this special session of the General Assembly, which is drawing to a close this week. But on issues like the Cyprus issue, or even more on East-West issues, the United Nations has not proved to be the appropriate forum for their resolution.
When you spoke rather menacingly, some people thought, about its perhaps becoming an empty shell. You meant if it continued in its general irresponsibility, its refusal to accept the credentials of various
If
countries.
the United Nations violates its charter in order to give expressions of political approval or disapproval to certain countries, such as the refusal to accept credentials of countries, which has the practical effect of expelling them from the General Assembly, something that is reserved to the Security Council and not to the General Assembly. When the largest single group in the General Assembly always invariably votes as a bloc, then the processes of reasoned debate end and pressure politics take over. And under those circumstances, it will degenerate gradually into a confrontation from which no one will benefit, which we don't particularly have to fear, but in which, in my view, it will become an empty shell. Now, I have to say that the warnings we've expressed have contributed to a somewhat more moderate approach in this 1-2-week session. How long this will last, we will have to see.
We have only a minute or two. I'd like to ask you this, Mr. Secretary. I once said to President Nixon that one of the things I admired hugely about Ronald Reagan was that he really didn't care what the New York Times thought about him. And Nixon said, well, I don't care at all. Now, it seemed to me plain that he did care, and it seems to me that most people care, because it is, in a sense, along with the Washington Post and a few others, the voice of the establishment. On the basis of your experience with the presidency, do you think it's possible for a president effectively and over a prolonged period of time to defy the American establishment?
Of course, the test of Ronald Reagan would be whether he doesn't care. It's no great achievement not to care about the New York Times in Sacramento. Mm-hmm. The test will be how he would feel if he were in Washington. Mm-hmm. Is it possible to defy the American establishment? Well, I don't think the American establishment is all that homogeneous. And I think that presidents and secretaries of state, if they know their mind, and if they can present it properly to the public, have an opportunity to carry out the policy that they think is in the national interest.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
For a printed, bound transcript of this program, send $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. That's $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. Production funding provided by public television stations, the Ford Foundation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.